Hello everyone, I am Marie Walker, the director of the Ada Mae Ivester Education Center here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and today I am going to be giving you a little bit of a fashion show. Yes, I will be showing you different types of Victorian winter accessories today. But first off, let's talk about my base layer. What am I wearing here? Well, since we are going to be talking about the general Victorian era, the Victorian era goes on from when Queen Victoria is crowned in the late 1830s all the way up into her death until 1901. So we have a very large span of time when we're talking about the Victorian era, almost 100 years. So I'm really going to be showing you mid-Victorian accessories today, which means from the period of around 1840 to 1860 is usually what we talk about as a mid-Victorian, or sometimes that can be defined as 1850 to 1870, and then early Victorian is 1830 1840. It depends on who's talking about it, but today I'm really going to be focusing on the 1850s and the 1860s. So a lot of the accessories that I'm going to be showing you today were in style at that time, which also brings up an interesting point about Victorian fashion, is that fashions, while they definitely changed, did not change as fast as our fashion world today. So some of these accessories could be in style for a couple decades. And we still have things that are in style for, different decades with just some slight variations. And the same thing happens with them. Think about blue jeans. Those have been in style forever, or khakis, or button-down shirts, flannels. But of course, slight variations change over time. Same thing with Victorian fashion. So let's start off with the caplet. So a caplet is a short cape coming down to the waist. This one is a wool caplet and is trimmed with fringe, which was a very popular trimming for different types of outerwear. So sometimes you'll even see shawls that are trimmed with fringe, and sometimes it can be a heavy fringe. This is a nice light fringe. So it's just a nice black wool caplet. Get a full view there. And this is, it has a fun kind of plaid lining, which I think is lovely. And it's nice black wool, so it's going to keep you warm. It's going to be very fashionable in this period. And it's also going to keep you dry. So if you're living in an area that has a lot of snow or rain, having an extra layer on the outside that you can then take off, especially something like wool, because wool is fantastic because it can keep you warm even when it's wet. So I can wear this out in the rain or in the snow, and it's still going to keep me warm even though this layer is going to get wet. Caplets themselves, just like capes, have been in style for a very long time, but it's really, they hit their height in the Victorian era, and they kind of go up and down. So how short the caplet is to how long the caplet is in style throughout the decades. And you really don't see caplets really in, say, the 18th century or the early 19th century. They really make their fashionable appearance in the Victorian era. So this is, again, probably what you associate with Victorian Christmas carolers. They're wearing capes and caplets, such as this one, probably having muffs and bonnets as well, the gentlemen wearing top hats. So this is very much a Victorian staple in a wardrobe. Also, it's less fabric than a cape, therefore it's kind of like a lightweight jacket, if you will, versus the cape, which is going to be very warm and longer. It's going to take also more fabric. You can have a caplet, which will not take as much fabric, and also it's going to keep you warm, just as not necessarily as warm as a cape because it's not covering as much of your body, but will take less fabric, and also perhaps is a little bit more fashionable depending upon the cape or the caplet. So you might wear this out and about in town, while a cape might be too cumbersome. That's a personal choice. Of course, with all fashion, we have to think about, you know, who would have worn this, why were they wearing it, and also what kind of class in society were they, what were they able to afford, how much were they going to be showing off, how much of this is practical. Of course, all fashion in some way is practical, as it is covering your body and providing coverage, but sometimes you have to think about how much of it is self-expression. So if someone is, you know, a poor person on the poorer end of the spectrum, they are going to probably be valuing function over self-expression because they need something that works to keep them warm, and they might not have the money to buy something super luxurious and pretty, but they're still going to express themselves in that way. They just don't have as many options. Versus a middling sort of person, which is pretty much what I am dressed as. I'm dressed as a middling sort of person from the 1850s. They're going to have perhaps a little bit more money so that they could have, you know, a little bit more choices. And then, of course, the wealthy have the most money, so they have the most choices. So this is a velvet caplet that I made, and it's not necessarily as warm as the wool caplet. It's a little bit more of a fashionable caplet that you would wear over perhaps a nice gown. It's not going to keep you necessarily as warm, but it is very pretty. So I'll give a twirl in this. I like the way that it moves. Of course, velvet is, you know, going to keep you warm, but it doesn't have that same property as wool. But it is still quite lovely and very fashionable. This is going to be worn for nice occasions rather than the wool, which could be worn for all occasions. And this is going to be, I am going to perhaps a dinner party, and I want to look very nice while arriving, and then I'll, you know, take the caplet off. This isn't necessarily to keep me warm. It's also to look fashionable while keeping me a little bit warm. Next up, we have the shawl, the ever fashionable shawl. This is a very large shawl with some very pretty decorative work on the bottom here. Again, it is decorated with fringe. So this is a very nice, very long shawl, especially in the back here, you can see. So sometimes the Victorian era is kind of synonymous with the shawl era. Shawls were incredibly popular during the Victorian era, and also shawls that are shaped like this. This is probably what you think of when you think of a shawl. Is this triangle shape, probably has some fringe, is probably knitted or crocheted, and this is probably what you think of when you think of a shawl. But shawls, they can come in all shapes and sizes. It's really just a piece of fabric that you are wearing over yourself, and that is a shawl. And those date back to Mesopotamia in the Fertile Crescent at the beginning of society. People have been wearing shawls because it's like the simplest version of keeping yourself warm is putting another piece of fabric over you. So, of course, shawls evolve in different cultures and in different styles. They look different, and a lot of cultures might have like their own type of shawls. I'm particularly thinking of the idea of Russian folk shawls, and they have, you know, their own beautiful patterns and stylings. But for the Victorian era, especially mid-Victorian that we're thinking of now, well, they look like this. They are triangular, they are knitted, they are crocheted, probably have some fringe. Decorativeness varies, so this was a little bit more of a decorative shawl here. It's also white, which means that it's perhaps not the most practical of colors, but also is the most practical color because that is the color that sheep are. Well, most sheep at least. Sometimes you do have a black sheep in the family, but most sheeps are white. Therefore, having white wool and white yarn means that you don't have to dye it, which means that it's going to be a less labor-intensive process, which means that this is also probably the cheapest yarn that you could get. But again, it's one of the most unpractical colors because, well, white gets dirty and shows the dirt very well. But really, we see shawls kind of go out of popularity once you get into the 1900s, into the Edwardian era. They kind of go away. They're thought of as being like kind of old and matronly and not fashionable anymore. But I still love a good shawl. I wish that it wasn't as attention drawing, perhaps is the right word, if I were to wear it out in public. Now, shawls, while I love them, are a little impractical because they're hard to work and do things while you're wearing one. So if I'm trying to cook or clean, I have all of this fabric or all of this yarn around me. So sometimes you can have a shawl pin, which kind of holds the shawl together, so it kind of acts almost as a caplet. While not being a caplet, shawls will keep you very warm. I would probably rank them below a caplet in warmth and also in formality. So this is going to be a little bit of a less formal way to keep warm. You're probably going to wear a shawl around the house, and then if you were going to go to market, you would probably wear a caplet. So here I am modeling a Sontag, also called a bosom buddy or a bosom friend, and it is basically a sweater or a shawl, but it just wraps around my body. So a sleeveless sweater, a shawl that has ends, so it really keeps my torso incredibly warm. And also it allows me to move my arms more freely. I don't have to try to, keep that shawl balanced on my shoulders or be bothered with the ends kind of hanging down and about. This is an incredibly practical invention that came about. I believe the first patterns that we see for this are in the 1850s. Now, you might be wondering, why is Sontag? Where does that name even come from? Well, it comes from the opera singer, the German opera singer, Henriette Sontag. Now, it's not necessarily clear if she popularized this style or if this style was just named after her, because she was a very popular opera singer who, well, she was really popular in the earlier 1800s, around 1820. And then she actually went into retirement. So she got married, her husband was a politician. The whole idea of women being on stage and out in public life was very controversial for pretty much all of the Victorian era. And therefore, when she got married, it was kind of thought that, oh, well, she should, give up her career on stage especially, and, just go and be his wife and a mother to their children. And she did that for a very long time until his political career kind of came crashing down. And then she went back to the stage 19 years later, and she experienced the same kind of success and fame that she had when she had started, because she was a huge name when she started, very popular, went into retirement, came back, and she came back in the 1850s. And that's kind of when she made her comeback. That's also when we see this style of garment come about as well. So it looks like it was named after her, kind of latching on to that popularity that she had to popularize this outfit. And we see different versions of this come about in Godey's Ladies Book. So Godey's Ladies Book was a very popular fashion magazine in America at the time. And it would show fashion plates of the newest fashions that were coming out for each season. It would also give directions on how to make different items. So they might, give you a knitting pattern for a Sontag, or sometimes they had like these little needle books that you can make, and different types of trim patterns. And it's, it's kind of like the Good Housekeeping or the Better Home and Gardens, or, the crafting YouTube of today. It gave you those type of tutorials and instructions on how to make different types of recipes and garments. It had everything, including Sontags. So I made this Sontag. I actually didn't have a pattern. I just looked at pictures of original ones on Pinterest and came up with this pattern myself. So I like having the trim on it. I think it's really pretty, and also I liked having perhaps a narrower version of a Sontag. Some of them can be quite large and more shawl-like, and I wanted one that was perhaps a little bit more petite because I already have a shawl. I wanted something that was very different. So I will give a quick spin. You can see my creation. So it's all one piece, and I will actually undo it so you can see kind of how it comes together. So that goes around on the back. And this ties in the front. So there are two long pieces that attach to the back. And I did the back in a V formation where it's smaller at the waist and then goes up to be kind of larger and cover more of the shoulders, because that was very much the silhouette of the time, was to have a small waist and then kind of creating those larger exaggerated shoulders. So my shoulder seams are actually off my shoulder, they're not actually on it, to help create that idea of, you know, wide shoulders make the waist look smaller, and then you have the, you know, petticoats to help fill out the rest of that hourglass down there. So that is just the style that I chose to do that, and I think it helps create that illusion as well. And then it just attaches, it's one giant piece that then wraps around the front. And it keeps me very, very warm. This is a fantastic garment. Again, ones that I wish would not attract so much attention if worn out in modern society. And then of course I did little scalloped edges for decoration on the ends, on the sides. They could be, have different types of trim around the Sontag, and sometimes it could be done with a different, I just did a double crochet stitch here. I don't know how to knit, I only know how to crochet. So I did a double crochet stitch for the body part of it, but sometimes it looks like they could have some different patterns to that as well, but most of it was a very, very tight pattern. You don't see kind of like a block pattern to it at all, and most of the time it's one color for the body and then one color for the trim. You don't see a lot of mixing of colors in the body, but every once in a while you'll see something that's like striped. But yeah, so this is the Sontag. Sadly, they went out of favor almost as fast as they were in. So you stop seeing them around the 1870s. They were really, really popular in the 1850s and 1860s though. So here I have a muff, and this is going to keep my hands nice and warm. And of course they would also have different types of gloves as well, so wool gloves or cotton gloves, leather gloves, that could keep their hands warm as they went out. But they also could have a muff. And muffs, they're very old. This idea of, you know, having a tube of fur that to stick your hands in to keep yourself warm goes back centuries. They were popular in the 18th century. Very much so. Of course, their size and width varies for style purposes as to, you know, if you had a nice little tiny muff or a big giant muff that, you know, hung down and covered some of your dress, the style varied. But muffs themselves, the idea of muffs were popular. And you see these up in almost into the Edwardian era. They kind of stay in popularity for quite a long time, just because they're so simple, and also they have become iconic. This idea of a muff, again, is probably in when you picture that Victorian caroler character, they are probably holding a muff as well. You'll see them if they're, you know, very fancy in ermine, or sometimes you'll see them out of rabbit or sometimes beaver. The fur could vary, and also depended on, you know, how rich you were. If you were a poorer person, rabbit fur is going to be a good way to go, because rabbits, well, they multiply like nobody's business, so therefore their fur and meat are rather cheap. So that is indeed the muff. Of course, they had scarves, a piece of fabric that goes around your neck to keep your neck warm. Basically like a shawl or a cape. It is putting another piece of fabric around you to keep you warm. This one is specifically for the neck, and sometimes even for the head. So you can also see ladies would style their scarves going around their head, like so. So the scarf could also function in different ways. It's just a small piece of fabric that people are going to use to keep themselves warm. And this way is actually keeping my head and my neck warm. And this was a popular way of doing it, usually for poorer or lower class people, because it's, you know, making one thing have multiple functions. So this is a nice gray wool scarf. Again, wool. This is great because it keeps you warm even when it's wet. Has some nice fringe on the bottom here because we still like to be decorative. And also fringe actually serves a purpose. Fringe helps kind of the water run off. So, you know, when the fabric gets wet and it's hanging down here, the fringe is kind of going to help that water bead and run off. So you'll see fringe on different outfits. It's not purely decorative always. Sometimes it is just because, like, well, it actually serves a functional purpose of, you know, trying to make sure it dries faster. I also have this scarf, which I think is also crocheted. Again, has the nice fringe at the bottom, but you can have wool scarves, you can have crocheted scarves. Sometimes the scarves would have fun patterns to them, like be striped, or they would have a couple stripes just down at the bottom. I think Queen Victoria actually made one that kind of almost had like a block pattern to it. So the scarves themselves could also be very fashionable and not just perhaps practical as well. So you can have kind of a not solely to keep you warm, but it'll keep you warm a little bit and also look really pretty. When you think of Victorian caroler, they're probably wearing scarves that look a lot like this. And we still wear scarves to this day because, well, they're practical, they're fashionable, and they keep our neck warm. And we don't like to get sore throats when it's cold out, which seems to kind of go hand in hand. Is, you know, you'll get a cold because you're cold. And scarves help prevent that. Now for headwear, people did not just wear scarves over their head, they actually had, you know, pieces of clothing dedicated to go on their head, such as hats and bonnets and hoods. So this one that I'm wearing here would actually more or less qualify as a hood. So like you think of a hoodie, you have that hood that goes up over you. Well, this is just a detached hood that is made from, I think this looks like it is knitted. I bought this one because I do not know how to knit. So it indeed looks like it is a knitted hood, and it's a beautiful knitted hood. You can tell it's a hood and rather than a bonnet because it looks like, well, it's more hood shaped. It doesn't have like necessarily defined like back like a bonnet might. It really just kind of hangs down to where it kind of has a nice like semicircle to the back here and looks like almost, you know, is a shape of a hood to where it could be attached to something else like a cape or a caplet. But of course, some capes had hoods. Those were not really fashionable in the Victorian era. When you think of a cape that has a hood, that's more 18th century. And hoods themselves became detached in separate items in the Victorian era. This one also has a very nice ruffle around it. I really like this one. I think it's very fashionable. It's very pretty, and also keeps you very warm. Now, as opposed to the hood, this is really a knitted cap. As you can see, it has a very defined back. It has a very defined front. It does not look like a hood that could be attached to another thing. It is very much its own separate defined garment, but it's still very pretty and decorative. It has a nice pattern to the side here. It has a lip which is purely decorative around it here with some different varying colors of yarn. Now while it can't come forward, it can be cinched. So here we can see can be cinched on the inside here. You can see there's a string that goes through here that keeps it very tight and fitted to my face so it doesn't, you know, blow off. It's going to keep my ears nice and warm. It has a nice very defined flat back. It has a beautiful knitted pattern here, a nice scalloped pattern, which I think is beautiful. So very functional, but also beautiful and decorative. And now for the, not quite the grand finale, but the next to last item that I'm going to show you today is my nice wool cape. This is some beautiful gray wool. I trimmed it with a nice black grosgrain ribbon, and this is a very fashionable style of cape for the mid-Victorian era. Does not all go all the way down. It's kind of a mid-range cape, if you will. It doesn't go all the way to the ground, but it's also not a caplet. But this way, the cape doesn't get dirty because it's not dragging on the ground. It also has this really kind of pretty pointed version in the back. I'll hold it out to the side so you can see the point as it comes down. And then it hangs beautifully in the back. It covers both of my arms, goes down basically to my knees. That's where my stockings are going to start. Also on this cape, it has a nice little flap over the top here, and that, while being very pretty and fashionable, it also serves a purpose. Because, as we talked earlier with the caplet, when rain and sleet and snow come down upon me, this little flap here is going to protect my big cape from getting wet and cold. So it's kind of like an extra layer of protection. And also, this is going to help water run off, and is also going to help me stay warm longer. So now that I've shown you some of the pieces of my mid-Victorian wardrobe that are going to help me keep me warm this winter, I am going to put together several pieces so that we can see the entire ensemble, as it were. But of course, I'm not going to wear every single piece that I showed you today. It does not make sense to wear, 2 caplets and a cape and a shawl. But I'm going to put together some of the pieces that you saw today to make a complete ensemble. All right, well now I am all dressed and warm and can head out into the Victorian winter, perhaps even for a sleigh ride. Thank you everyone for attending my talk about mid-Victorian fashion. This is one of my absolute favorite time periods for fashion history. As you can probably tell, I have a lot of pieces from it. It's just such an interesting time for fashion and for just humanity at large, and for especially Christmas, as a lot of our Christmas traditions and holiday traditions that we celebrate today or are part of our American culture today really stem back to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and, the Victorian fashion that they helped put together. So thank you so much, and until next time.
Today, we're going to be talking about something that I actually really like to talk about and like to consume. It's Civil War food. Now, it's important to remember that those who fought in the Civil War had a very monotonous affair, and the things I'm going to show you today, you have to keep that in mind. Remember that this is what they're going to be having on campaign, on the march, day after day after day.
And today, I'm going to be talking to you about the history of sewing.
So today, we're going to look specifically at the weapons and the armor of the Norman Conquest, and specifically the Battle of Hastings.
And today I'm going to take you through getting dressed in a robe à la Française, which is a fancy French way of saying a French dress.
But I want to sort of walk you through what it was to actually write a letter to someone, some of the tools that we have from the 18th and really early 19th century.
I'd like to talk to you about my thesis that I'm working on at University of North Georgia, and it's called Home is Where the Haunt Is, the Cultural History of the Domestic Seance in Victorian London.
In the 1870s and 1880s, the most powerful institution in New York, and one of the most powerful in the whole country, was Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was in New York City, and it was the political bosses. It was a corrupt ring of bosses that ran everything. They ran the government, they were in all the businesses. And the leader of the ring was a man named Tweed, and they called him Boss Tweed.